Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. On today's episode, we are going to mind the science. We've got Dr. Jonathan Stea, who is a full-time practicing clinical psychologist, adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Calgary. He specializes in the assessment and treatment of concurrent addiction and mental health disorders, and he's a two-time winner of the University of Calgary's Award for Excellence in Clinical Supervision and co-editor of the book. I've been following Dr. Stea for a long time online, and I've been trying to get him on the show. Last time I DM'd was like 3 years ago. And then I saw he had written a new book, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So I was like, oh, hey, how about now? And he said, great, let's do it. So I finally got him on the show and we're going to get started. So the book is called Mind the Science, and I strongly recommend that everyone check it out because it's about the intersection of the wellness industry and really psychology, the anti-psychiatry movement. So Dr. Stea, thanks so much for being on the show.
My absolute pleasure. And again, thanks so much for your patience. It took me 3 years to write the book. So that's why it's been a long time coming. So thank you for your patience. And I'm very excited to be here.
My first question, actually, I didn't put on the list of questions that I sent to you because I've been following you for so long with your online footprint. I see the amount of abuse that you take online, right? Because you're trying to expose the grifters in the wellness industry, people that are trying to trick our patients, trick us, take their money, really shine a light on the wrong things. So we take the focus off of good science, good medicine, and they end up bringing everyone's attention to the wrong place. But people get that involved in their identity, right? I am a person that believes in this. And so then when you undermine that, they really end up lashing out at you. And so why do you put yourself in that situation, right? Why do you put yourself out there and end up taking that abuse?
Ask myself that question every day, Brad, because it really is a lot. Ever since Elon Musk took over X, it's grown exponentially. I literally receive hundreds of abusive messages a day across platforms, but it's much bigger on X. And I'm by no means the only one. A lot of people in the science communication community experience that. There was a Nature survey that came out interviewing physicians and other health professionals during the COVID-19 pandemic who spoke out about COVID-19 and trying to correct misinformation. And they received all sorts of horrible things like threats to reputation and death threats and personal attacks. And it really has chased a lot of people off social media. So I get that it's not for everyone. And I understand if it's threatening someone's mental health and if people aren't willing to take it, that's perfectly understandable. And I don't blame anyone. What's kept me here, though, to be honest, is I started science communication work about 5 years ago or so, starting out really because the Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists says that one of our fourth order principles is a responsibility to society. And that means promoting and practicing evidence-based care. And the converse of that is correcting mental health related misinformation and pseudoscience for the benefit of society. And so one way in which to fulfill that ethical and professional obligation is to do it online. And so I really started out doing that through piggybacking off my graduate school work. And then I got online and just said, holy cow, like it's much bigger than the area of cannabis addiction, which is where I actually started. Misinformation is just a threat in general, beyond addiction, beyond mental health, to all of health
existential threat to civilization, right? Like with climate change, it is an absolute existential threat to humanity and the planet.
Agreed. So I think we're on the same team here, and as long as we can muster through it, and I think it's important for science communicators to have good social support and coping skills and just ask themselves to weigh the risks and benefits of doing it. For me, the benefits outweigh the costs because I do get a lot of support and I'm used to it by now. I'm used to the trolling and harassment and I'm well practiced at managing it. But again, it's not for everyone.
Oh, yeah.
And I get that.
I've noticed that recently. You've been posting the trolling comments with retorts. I think that's a really healthy way to handle them. That's great.
That's one way in which I manage.
So let's take a step back and just talk about really the anti-psychiatry movement. There's the anti-psychiatry movement. There's the wellness movement. And so we'll get to how those are, refer to them as bedfellows for you in your book. But let's start with the origins of the anti-psychiatry movement.
Yeah. And I think people are less familiar with the anti-psychiatry movement. People hear of the anti-vaccine movement, and that's a more popular one, which again is bedfellows with the anti-psychiatry movement and the wellness industry. But the anti-psychiatry movement really dates back to at least the 1960s or so. And it was basically a reaction to psychiatry's various missteps. Its intellectual pillars were Thomas Sass, who was a disgruntled psychiatrist, and other scholars in the area, R.D. Lang and David Cooper, coined anti-psychiatry in 1967. And what they were reacting to was, again, psychiatry's missteps. There was the inappropriate pathologizing of minority groups. There was inhumane asylum care. There was this perceived arbitrariness of diagnosis, basically people thinking that we don't know what we're doing with respect to how we. And so the anti-psychiatry movement was a reaction to that by looking at things through what's called a critical theory lens or a critical psychiatry lens, which is trying to view psychiatry through social dynamics and power structures and things like that. And the good news is that it actually worked. It helped psychiatry get its act together, so to speak, and it pushed it to be a more humane discipline and a more scientific discipline, focusing not just on siloed pill dispensing in biology, but a lively focus on not only the biological factors or contributors to mental illness, but also the psychological and the social factors. And those inhumane asylum hospitals were shut down and care was moved into the community and regular hospitals. And so that was a really great thing. And so by about the 1980s or so, the movement greatly diminished, but it really didn't die. And it really just transformed and lost its way. And so now what we see in its modern carnation is this sort of pseudoscientific smorgasbord of the anti-psychiatry movement, which gets its lifelines from different areas. So there's Scientology, which is a cult, and it's a fringe area, but that's only one spoke on the wheel. There's also, again, fringe scholars or fringe experts, so to speak, who will publish things, essentially propaganda about psychiatry on various sources like blogs or books or websites like Mad in America, which are designed to dodge scientific critique. They're not published in mainstream medical journals, or if they are,
Yeah.
they're grossly overgeneralized and hyped and turned into propaganda. And then, of course, there are harmed patients, like there are in the anti-vaccine movement, people that identify as being vaccine injured. The problem, though, is that when you get into the online world, there is just a total gong show, for lack of a better word, in terms of misinformation spread. There's just
Yeah.
so much anti-psychiatry propaganda nowadays. And what I mean by that is things like denying the existence of mental illness at all, saying depression doesn't exist, schizophrenia doesn't exist, all psychiatric medications are more harmful than helpful. And we get these, even though that's the sources of the anti-psychiatry movement, these tropes and this propaganda has really become baked into our culture. And it's a big thing. You got major influencers like Andrew Tate online who's tweeting to hundreds and millions of people that depression doesn't exist, or Elon Musk saying several times that SSRIs, which are antidepressants, are more harmful than helpful. And these guys aren't per se part of the anti-psychiatry movement, but they're parodying anti-psychiatry tropes. And people will tend to believe this stuff because the more we hear misinformation, the more likely we are to believe it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be some libertarian ethos there. Like the whole concept of you should be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like you're sad because you doing this, right? And so I'm not sad because I'm living my life well and eating right and exercising. And all you have to do is do things like me, and then you won't have these symptoms either. Like there seems to be some parallel there.
I think so. Yeah. You got guys like Andrew Tate's tweets, and they're saying that the only people who get depression, and I'm quoting here, he says that it's fat, lazy men, essentially. So like he'll use those stigmatizing terms,
Yeah.
fat, lazy. And it's very, what that does is it positions health as a moral virtue, essentially, that people with good health are morally virtuous and the ones that aren't. And that essentially has its roots in the wellness industry and the alternative medicine community, that kind of moralizing of health.
Because the next question was, why were the wellness industry and anti-psychiatry movements destined to be bedfellows? And it seems like that's the, is there any more to it?
I think that's the main component, but the other main component too is that both the wellness industry and the anti-psychiatry movement and the anti-vaccine movement, essentially anti-science movement, they all serve as foils to mainstream medicine at large. And that's why they make good bedfellows, because essentially, in order for those movements to succeed and the wellness industry to succeed, it requires a polarizing, divisive narrative that
Yeah.
sows distrust in mainstream medicine. For example, if people go onto a wellness website or a wellness Instagram reel or an alternative medicine website, you'll see things like mainstream medicine doesn't know what it's doing. They'll literally say things like mainstream medicine only masks the symptoms. They don't address the root cause. We address the root cause. But
Yeah.
when you dig deeper, it's a pseudoscientific or false root cause. It's because it's saying that the root cause of someone's depression is either a diet deficiency that you didn't know you had, or it's an energy blockage that you didn't know that you had that doesn't exist, that you need energy healing to fix. So that's how they're bedfellows.
What your doctor doesn't want you to know, right?
It's
Those, oh,
exactly,
triggering posts.
exactly right. That's the narrative. That's why they make bedfellows, because that is the ideology.
They're turning us into the enemy and then profiting off of it, which makes our jobs harder. It undermines confidence in the healthcare system, in public health, and in healthcare practitioners. So they are, and I was going to ask this as a question later, but let's get this out now. That's one of the problems with giving into pseudoscience beliefs. Like my wife will say, just let them have their healing crystals, just let them have it. Everyone understands that might lead to delayed care or that might lead to misdiagnosis. But as long as they're following up with their oncologist and they're doing all the things that allopathic medicine, modern medicine recommends, just let them have their fringe pseudoscience beliefs too. But I think that undermines, like by legitimizing that, they then go on to undermine us. And so we have to push back in the right setting against stuff like that.
Yeah. And the irony is that when pseudoscientific treatments are marketed in a deceiving way, using the narrative that evidence based treatments don't work and that ours do, ironically, that doesn't respect patient autonomy and patient choice, because that's not a real choice between science and pseudoscience. If you're not honest and forthright at the informed consent process about the relative risks and benefits of a treatment, if you're telling a patient that homeopathy or energy healing or some diet protocol will treat your post-traumatic stress disorder or your depressive disorder, you're not respecting their rights because you're not being honest about the truth. And it's even worse if the clinician doesn't know the difference, which we often see in the wellness world as well, because I think that some of the grifters actually buy into their own BS.
I would think that most of them are not out there intentionally deceiving people. And you can tell me as a psychologist if I'm right or wrong on this, because I think most people are the hero of their own story. They're the good guy. Nobody's the villain of their own story. So don't think they're doing the thing and maybe playing a little with the edges. Okay, I know this isn't working so well, but they seem to love it. So let's keep selling this. But really, in their heart of hearts, believe that what they are doing is the right thing. What do you think about that?
I would agree with that. I think that's the vast majority of cases. I think it's a minority who are just maliciously out to financially exploit people. I think the vast majority of people buy into their own pseudoscientific health ideology, like really believe in what they're doing and they've incorporated it in their identity. And in some ways, that makes it more dangerous
Yes.
because now they have a fight to go for and they think that, as you said, they're the hero and they need to push back against this evil empire, big pharma, mainstream medicine, whatever it is. And that makes them very dangerous. What comes to mind is I think of RFK Jr. out in the US, leaders of the anti-vaccine movement. I think they actually believe it, most of them. So
Yes. Speaking of RFK Jr., there was recently a protest outside of Kellogg, which I think is really interesting that they would protest outside of Kellogg, right? Because for a couple of reasons. One is when I was in my 20s, there was this protest outside of Occupy Wall Street, where they were going to like sleep outside Wall Street as if the people that worked at Wall Street are just going to step right over you. They don't care. You're going to protest somewhere, protest it in front of Congress where they like can make the laws that regulate what happens on Wall Street. Don't occupy Wall Street. So they're basically occupying Kellogg, right? To protest the use of artificial dyes and all these things where really that's not the problem. Yeah, Fruit Loops are trash. They're delicious, but they're trash. It's not the dyes that make them trash, guys. It's the Fruit Loop that's the problem. So they protest outside. They're acolytes of RFK Jr. But you talk in your book about Kellogg, right? About Mr. Kellogg. And I think they have some things in common, right? Like the people that are protesting outside Kellogg with the original Mr. Kellogg. Those influencers and Mr. Kellogg have in common.
it's a bit ironic in that sense, right? Because John Harvey Kellogg was a really popular physician back in the day, over 100 years ago. Him and his brother was the one who actually founded it. His brother took it off with the Kellogg Company. And John Harvey Kellogg in 1878 set up this thing called the Battle Creek Sanitarium. It was basically this giant medical facility and spa. And anyway, he became just a really popular physician and he sold this magazine. The name of the magazine escapes me, but they made millions of dollars. It was very popular in its time. And it was the social media of its time, so to speak. It pushed a lot of health related misinformation, essentially along the exact same lines as we see RFK Jr. and the wellness industry doing today, because essentially what they're parroting is the idea that diet and lifestyle change, it's great, but they pitch it as a be all end all, and it adds that moralizing quality that we
Yeah.
mentioned. So they will pitch things like diet and exercise are the cure all for all ailments. And if no one is doing that, then again, they're morally lazy or they're morally wrong. And it's just scientifically absurd too, because obviously the health conditions, whether it's psychopathology in the mental health world or more broadly, obviously the etiology of health conditions derive from much more than lifestyle change. That is a big component. But what happens in the wellness industry and what's been happening for hundreds of years is that it emphasizes or magnifies the role of personal choice or personal behaviors at the neglect of social factors and at the neglect of genetics and just sometimes plain old bad luck. And I think that's what we're seeing.
And then when they push back, they always push back with, then you don't believe it's important to exercise, as if, guys, yes, but we're saying that the problem isn't yellow dye number 4, right? And life is complicated. Human biology is complicated. Our social structures are complicated, and you are grossly oversimplifying them. And that's it.
There's a perfect quote that I think gets it. It's from Michelle Cohen. She's a family physician, and I quote her in the book. She wrote about Kellogg and the history of the wellness industry as well. And she said, there's a huge difference between lifestyle counseling and selling lifestyle as a cure-all. The former makes you a healthcare provider. The latter makes you a grifter.
Yeah.
And that's the truth, right? Because we, as bona fide health professions, I run a self-care group in our addictions clinic every week of talking about nutrition and exercise. And obviously that's part of evidence-based care, but there's more to it. And the thing is, evidence-based healthcare professionals will talk about the benefits of good exercise and good nutrition. The wellness industry sells bizarre, unsupported diet protocols and supplements and things that seemingly are good and nutritious. There's no evidential backing.
They'll make it so impossible to get it right that you can always just turn around and blame the patient. You're not doing it well enough. You're not doing it right. You're not eating at the right times. You're not eating the right foods. There's toxins in this. There's toxins in that. You forgot to wear your yellow tinted sunglasses, your blue
Exactly.
blockers.
Exactly. Right.
So alternative medicine, because it seems like there's like wellness, right? Which is this big umbrella that even includes lifestyle changes that are good, right? Like gyms, right? Fall under wellness. But within the umbrella of wellness, there's alternative medicine, right? Because we're getting into this like pseudoscience type. And there's an anti-psychiatry movement within alternative medicine, right? And so where am I going with this? So the question is, how is alternative medicine, which seems like disparate beliefs to me, it's an ideology unto itself. So how is it that alternative medicine, and I apologize, it turned out to be a bit of a non sequitur. I apologize. It's a little jarring for the listeners where I'm going with this, but we're talking about, so alternative medicine, it seems like many disparate beliefs and ideas, but yet it is one ideology unto itself. How is that possible?
That's one of the main themes, the major arguments that I try to make in the book and that I really want to help people understand it. And the argument is such that alternative medicine is not merely a set of unsupported or pseudoscientific treatments, just homeopathy or energy healing or some weird diet protocol. It's an entire ideology with its own tropes, which are repeated themes and ideas, its own fallacies that have been used to cajole audiences. So things like the appeal to nature fallacy and appeal to tradition fallacy. It has its own propaganda tactics. It publishes in pseudoscientific journals, which is a topic we can get into. That in and of itself is what makes it the ideology. It's that narrative that we talked about, because it needs that narrative, that divisive ideology that contrasts itself with mainstream medicine and creates an us versus them. That's how it sells pseudoscientific wares, so to speak. It needs that. And
Yeah.
that's the ideology. And what I try to do in the book is teach the language of that ideology. And I highlight a list of these tropes and those propaganda tactics, because I want people to be able to see and hear that language when it's spoken. And you'll know the language. It goes things like, again, the evils of big pharma, or our treatments are more natural, or our treatments address the root cause. And that's essentially propaganda and ideology. And yeah, it does have a history, and it grew in parallel again over the last 100 years as healthcare professions themselves got more broadly from a scientific perspective. They adopted evidence-based medicine as their philosophy, and they baked it into their codes of ethics and their legal standards of practice. The parallel process to that is that there's been alternative medicine, and it's sort of shape shifted in its name and it's rebranded over time as well. The actual term alternative medicine wasn't actually used until about the 1970s. Before that, it was called various other things like unconventional medicine or fringe medicine or natural healing and things like that. Alternative medicine began to be used in the 1970s. And there's a great book written by James Horton, who's a medical historian. And he talked about how that's a very purposeful thing because the term alternative medicine connotes a modicum of legitimacy. It's a
Yeah.
false balance. It says that
Yeah.
it's on the same playing field as mainstream medicine. And then as time
Listen,
went
it's like
on,
super salad. Do you want a soup or do
exactly.
you alternative? You can have the salad. Do you want mainstream medicine?
So the term bakes the ideology into it. So we could see the divisive narrative. And then, of course, in the 90s, we got integrative medicine and functional medicine, which essentially do the same sleight of hand, trying to further sneak pseudoscience into mainstream healthcare, or essentially sneak alternative medicine into mainstream healthcare.
So functional medicine in particular drives me nuts because that term, the implication. So like I'm an otolaryngologist. I treat the ear, nose, and throat. I am not an orthopedic surgeon. So by definition, I am an ear, nose, and throat doctor and not an orthopedic surgeon. So by calling yourself a functional medicine doctor indicates that rather assumes that someone who's not practicing functional medicine is a non-functional doctor or a dysfunctional doctor or a misfunctional doctor, right? So you are excluding those other people. And so you're putting yourself above them. So by saying you're functional medicine, you're saying that someone else is non functional. So I practice non functional otolaryngology because someone else brands themselves as a functional otolaryngologist. That is absurd. I'm not trying to find the root cause of my patient's illnesses. Really? What does that say about me? So the fact that it denigrates us really gets under my skin. Integrative medicine, I can understand that a little more because you're trying to integrate something that other doctors aren't, right? They're integrating things that I'm not integrating. I'm not saying those things are legitimate, but at least the term isn't undermining me, right?
Well,
Now we can, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
you nailed it, right? It's branding, and I hear that loud and clear. And I think that is the risk. And so, again, I think what will help listeners understand this, there's a quote, two quotes from David Gorski, who is a leader in the skeptic movement, and he heads up
Another one I've been
science-based
trying to, we were
medicine.
messaging back and forth and I couldn't make it happen. Yeah,
Try to
sorry.
get him. He's wonderful. Try to get
I'm
him
trying.
because he's been doing this stuff for decades, debunking the space. An integrative medicine brand pitches itself as the best of both worlds because it's trying
Yeah.
to combine conventional or mainstream medicine with alternative medicine. Of course, you're not really combining the best of both worlds if your alternative medicine is pseudoscientific, if it has those foundations. Anyways, but like you said, at least the sleight of hand is laudable if you're trying to, again, combine these best of both worlds. But what David Gorski called functional medicine was the worst of both worlds because what it does is it combines the massive over testing that we see in mainstream medicine, the over testing and the over pathologizing, with just pure quackery, which is your alternative medicine pseudoscientific treatments.
Oh my God. And the amount of counseling I do on the perils of testing, right? Because we find stuff and then those are incidentalomas. And there are studies that show that over testing improves patient satisfaction, right? But leads to worse outcomes because then you end up having to do things that some of which carry risk, right? And so it's getting this testing as someone who's trying to take the best care that I can of my patients. And then you've got another field that's like, you know what? They don't even know how to interpret this stuff,
Yeah,
right? They don't care about you. They didn't get all these tests. They don't know. And yeah, you're going to find some abnormal labs that you're going to treat with a supplement that you buy from that person.
exactly.
I've been saying recently on social media, much to, getting a little, not as much pushback as you, but a little bit. Anytime you find a physician who's selling out our profession, they're probably selling a supplement. If they're selling us out, they're selling something. And that's what we
Exactly.
see with functional medicine because they're selling supplements to fix your problem that you don't even have.
Yes.
No.
Did blur the branding too. And there's integrative functional medicine websites too. And I just had a guy message me. He's a supporter on Instagram, and he messaged me and said that this major integrative functional medicine clinic in Calgary just milked him $40,000 worth. He cleaned out his life savings, and it's terrible. And that story is not unique either. And again, that's due to this massive, they were just testing and supplements. And then all of it was for naught. It was
Yeah.
just a big waste of time and money for this poor guy.
There's a phrase in your book that I love. Desperation is intoxicating. Desperation is intoxicating, and they're capitalizing on that desperation, but they feel like they're doing the right thing. Like they go to sleep every night in the heart of hearts thinking that they're doing the right thing. And that's, like you said earlier, that's what makes them even more dangerous.
Road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah. So there's integrative medicine we just talked about, and there is functional medicine. And then there's this other field that I just want to touch on a little bit called naturopathy, which for me, like you said earlier, the appeal to nature fallacy. It is a field that's derived from a logical fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. Nature is better, so we're going to make everything natural, which is just an incorrect way to reason. And yet you get a doctorate in it. And the reason I brought it up is because you, in your book, you talk about the case of Jason Klopp, who's a naturopath. He was selling his nephew's feces, saying that it would repopulate patients' gut microbiomes and it would cure their autism, because, of course, that was the root cause of autism, right? Not that autism is inordinately complicated and we're learning more and more every day, but that it's something wrong with your gut microbiome. What was his lawyer's defense?
So the lawyer's defense was because this happened in British Columbia, and Jason Klopp was being investigated by his college of naturopathic physicians for essentially practicing unethically. So then they went to the Supreme Court of BC, I believe, and his lawyer said that naturopathy is unscientific anyway. So what are we essentially arguing about here? That he can't punish Jason for not practicing from a scientific perspective, but
Yeah.
naturopathy is fundamentally unscientific. And so he
Yeah.
had a point, right? How can you fault them for that when they're also promoting things that are pseudoscientifically absurd, like homeopathy and acupuncture? Incidentally, they lost the case, and I believe Jason Klopp lost his license as well.
So, because the tenets of the underpinnings are ultimately unprovable, unscientific, and absurd, he should be able to continue doing this. That reminds me of the Fox News argument, where Fox News got sued for putting out misinformation, and their lawyers, I forgot which show it was for, but it could be for any of them. Their lawyers' defense was any reasonable person shouldn't be interpreting this as news. This is entertainment. So they shouldn't be held to the standard of a journalist. They should be held to the standard of an entertainment show. And so those two arguments just sound so similar. So naturopathy and Fox News have something in common.
I think Joe Rogan said something similar, how he was attacked. And he said, why is anyone listening to what I have to say? I'm not a
Yeah.
health professional or something like that.
Yeah.
So
Propping up misinformation and should have no accountability.
I think the reason I talked about
Well, yeah,
that
he's not a journalist. He's a comedian. That's a fair argument. We shouldn't be taking him seriously. It just so happens
Yeah.
that people do, and lots of people do. He's not
Exactly.
painting himself as a journalist. Look at him. Just look at him. Look at how he looks, how he talks. He's not presenting himself as a journalist. I can understand his argument.
Exactly. I think, though, I just really want to touch upon this because it's such an important point. The reason I talked about that example in the book is because I think it really highlights one of the dangers of pseudoscience and basically how it becomes legitimized in our healthcare systems, our profession, because, we talk about things like legally non-protected titles. So basically anyone can be a wellness coach or a wellness consultant or even a therapist, depending on particular countries and jurisdictions, because there's no regulatory body or licensing body to regulate that. So anyone could do it. My mom, my friend could just set up an Instagram feed and call themselves a therapist or wellness coach, but not so when you have something like a college regulating naturopaths or chiropractors, or in Ontario, even homeopaths are regulated. It's the only province in Canada that has a regulatory body for homeopathy.
I'm
And so
sorry.
it then raises,
Wow.
it's insane.
Wow.
It's insane. And then
It's
it raises
insane.
the question for me, which I don't know the answer to, what's more harmful? And it's unclear to me. Do you have a grifter with no license and no accountability, or one where you do have healthcare professional vet accountability and is essentially, so basically having regulatory bodies legitimize things
Yeah.
like naturopathy and homeopathy?
I think that question is similar to, would you go onto a pseudoscience podcast and have a debate with someone? Would you go and have a televised debate with someone who promotes pseudoscientific beliefs? And the answer seems to be no, right? Why? Because it legitimizes them. So I think the answer to this is no, there shouldn't be a governing body because it does legitimize them. It gives you ability to regulate, but how can you, back to that same naturopathy lawyer's argument, like how do you regulate something that's not rooted in something that makes sense?
I tend to agree with you.
One of the classes that I took in college was alternative medicine. When I was deciding to go into medical school, it seemed tempting to become one of those doctors that espouses these different beliefs. When you could have a clinic that has all the, it seemed like a good business proposition and something I could really be proud of until I learned more. So one of the classes I took in college, alternative medicine, The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down, is a famous book about a Hmong girl who developed seizure disorder, and the family was trying to navigate modern medicine within their own belief system. And that was the challenge. Like, you have to respect people's belief system and their way of understanding the world. And the doctors just weren't bridging that gap. So they couldn't make the family understand how important it was for this girl to take her medication. And I'm not sure I'm remembering it all correctly because I did read it when I was like 19 and I'm 45. So might be misremembering some stuff. But what I'm getting to is here we are pushing back against these belief systems because they are not rooted in any type of scientific understanding of the world. So, how can you be respectful of an indigenous culture with its own beliefs around healing, but also pushing back against pseudoscientific beliefs?
It's a delicate dance. Incidentally, is evidence-based practice baked into our codes of ethics and legal standards of practice, but so is the idea of cultural competency, at least for psychologists, and I believe for other bona fide health professions as well. So what that means is practicing from a culturally competent lens. Individual clinicians need to tune into and try to be sensitive towards their own biases and their own worldviews and their own belief systems and how that impacts patient care. And then also be curious and strive for knowledge, the worldviews and belief systems and cultures of their patients, and to practice in ways that are very relevant to that. There's labs and research facilities and scientists devoting their careers to study and incorporate this topic into evidence-based practice. That's a very important thing. That's not the same thing, though. I think what it comes down to, again, is the informed consent process and really being honest and forthright with respect to the harms and benefits of the treatments that we have. And I could add to that too, because I think that's often, it's another part of the ideology that I think the wellness industry and alternative medicine capitalizes on. And there's an idea called Orientalism, which is this cherry picking, stereotyping, and romanticizing aspects of, say, the Eastern world or other just cultures in general, to again say that their treatments are exotic or culturally sensitive and have been used for years or whatever the hell they say it is.
Yeah.
When in fact, that's not true. It's essentially cultural appropriation. And there's lots been written about that as well. People can look to Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop company, which is a $250 million natural lifestyle company, and they can find a 3-day Ayurvedic detox plan. Or Kourtney Kardashian has her Poosh website where you can find Ayurvedic asparagus recipes. So that's not practicing culturally competent ways. And same with, I talked about this in a very tragic case in my book about James Arthur Ray, who set up the Sedona sweat lodges as a way to treat a variety of health conditions. And under his care, he was just a white guy with no indigenous training, didn't have elder training, didn't know how to do safety with respect to the sweat lodges, and 3 people died, unfortunately. And I interviewed one of the victims' sisters in my book because they ended up developing a website and an organization called Seek Safely to try to remind people of the harms of wellness gurus who, again, try to masquerade and hijack these notions of spirituality or quote unquote other ways of knowing that are supposed to be helpful. And again, incorporating other ways of knowing and being culturally competent is part of our ethical conduct. But masquerading that under the banner of wellness is what's false, and pitching other ways of knowing in a scientific way by saying that their treatments work is pseudoscience.
And back to everyone being the hero of their own story, that gentleman is now out of prison and painting himself as the victim in that situation, right?
Absolutely. He is.
Yeah.
And the family was disappointed by it. And yeah, it's just terribly tragic. And I think he's still running some sort of business. He even wrote a book about that and how he tried to get vindicated through that experience and find his own redemption and back to doing whatever the hell he's doing in terms of health coaching.
So, how can we avoid falling into these traps ourselves, right? Because there is some appeal to it. That's why it exists. And then, in the same vein, help our patients to identify these problematic, unscientific ways of thinking. I guess let's start off with what are the common tropes, right? What are the trends? If you want to be able to use heuristics to just spot it immediately.
Yeah. So I wish I had a nice way to summarize them. So what I ended up doing in my book is throwing them all in the back because there's so many of them, right? And again, this is what I tried to mean by trying to teach people the language of pseudoscientific grift or the language of alternative medicine because, for example, there's 9 red flags of pseudoscience that I talk about that people can. I want people to memorize these things if we can to help people spot pseudoscientific claims. So things like elevating anecdotal evidence or testimonials splattered all over websites, or the use of sciencey sounding language to pitch unsupported claims, or again, claims that are completely divorced from the scientific literature more broadly. So using human energy fields and quantum physics to treat someone's health condition. So those are just 3 of various 9 other or more pseudoscientific red flags. And then there's alternative medicine tropes as well. So treating the root cause, their treatments are more natural, they're safer, etc. And so there's lists of these things. And I just really, I would love people to, because they helped me and I think they help my family and my friends. And I would just like people to memorize these things if they can, because I think once people become equipped with that language, you can't unsee it, whether it's on social media or on a local alternative medicine clinic website.
And you definitely can't unsee it. Okay. There can sometimes be like a blurry line between science and pseudoscience, right? Like you pointed out a couple of things that are painfully obvious, right? Like energy healing, right? There are no Jedi. I'm sorry. As much as we've definitely tried to use the force and tried to move objects with our minds, unfortunately, there is no force, right? So that's obvious, right? Homeopathy, it's obvious. There's no molecule of the substance left. There's no way it's going to heal you. But there can be a blurry line between where real science ends and where pseudoscience begins. So, how do you, especially in psychiatry, because the brain is just so complicated and things can be so nebulous. So, how do you find the line?
It's a tough line, right? And that line is known in the history and philosophy of science as a demarcation problem. So it asks, where do we demarcate or draw that line between science and pseudoscience? And what helps me understand that again is going back to these red flags, because at the end of the day, trying to decide whether something is pseudoscientific becomes a probabilistic endeavor, meaning the more warning signs that we see and that we hear, the more likely it is that we've unearthed something pseudoscientific. And you're right. So those extremes can be very apparent and it gets really murky in that gray zone. And that's very tough from a clinician perspective and from a regulatory body perspective. Examples in psychiatry or clinical psychology of the world of mental health would be things like psychedelic assisted therapy for the treatment of depression or cannabis assisted therapy, even mindfulness meditation, EMDR, things like that for PTSD. And so what differentiates those gray zones from the extremes, though, is that those gray zones tend to have more what we call scientific plausibility. So there could be a scientific mechanism that makes sense, but the way in which these treatments are marketed and the claims surrounding them still have either bad science or
Yeah.
pseudoscientific. And so the way to navigate that is just to be highly skeptical from a patient perspective and a clinical perspective, and try not to put the cart before the horse, and hopefully study the hell out of these things so that they can be incorporated in the clinical practice guidelines.
That sounds like it's not the line between science and pseudoscience, but it sounds like the difference between research and practice. Those things are an active area of research. And so people are taking an active area of research and extrapolating it to become it's not the standard of care, because if you wait for medicine to make it the standard of care, you're going to be waiting a long time. But we already know these things work, so let's do it, as opposed to data isn't really there. It's coming into clarity and maybe soon. It looks like people are just pitching that stuff to make a buck, right?
Yeah, I think where it becomes, it's a great point, where it becomes pseudoscientific again is the way in which it's marketed and sold. And like, for example, like psychedelic assisted therapy, again, it's plagued by bad data, bad science, essentially. I'm hoping that we can get to a point where, again, we study the hell out of it and we can then incorporate it into the arsenal of psychiatric treatments, because not all of our evidence-based treatments are helpful. That would be
Yeah.
great. But nowadays, even today, anyone can just Google a psychedelic assisted wellness retreat or a psychedelic assisted, even a physician marketing this stuff. And they'll say again, that this treatment is better than SSRIs and it's the best treatment that we have to treat all your mental health disorders. So again, it's the way in which, and with anecdotal evidence. So it's being pitched with cherry picking studies and overhyping them. So it's pitched in a pseudoscientific way.
Yeah. I think because the listeners are physicians, they can think of it as anytime putting on a patient on a medication, you're recommending a procedure, you're always going to talk about like the risks and the benefits. And ultimately, this stuff is complicated and there's nuance. And so if it's being marketed in a way that lacks the type of nuance that you would use in a discussion with your patients, it's probably fringy garbage.
Brilliant. I love that.
So before we close, you spend so much time and effort debunking misinformation, trying to put good information out there. I want to recruit our listeners to do the same. And one of the reasons we do need to do that is because of something that you quote in the book, which is Brandolini's Law. What is Brandolini's Law?
Yes. Brandolini's Law is that old internet adage, which, again, all science communicators would at least know experientially. I don't want to butcher the quote, but it goes, the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than it is to produce it, which
That
basically
sounds
just
right.
means it's incredibly hard and effortful to debunk garbage, essentially.
Since we've already put one profanity in the episode, I'm going to quote your book for the second profanity of the episode, which is my other favorite phrase, pseudo-profound bullshit. I love that line. Anytime I see like this gobbledygook garbage in someone's post, Deepak Chopra is one of those people that puts all these like big, grand sounding words. And if you really drill down to it, a lot of it's meaningless. Pseudo-profound bullshit. Is what you just read genuine sounding, or is it pseudo-profound bullshit?
Yes. That term actually derives from Gordon Pennycook's work, and his research team won an Ig Nobel Prize for it. It's like a parody of the Nobel Prize, but it's legit. And it's basically it's awarded to science discoveries that make you laugh and then make you think. I think that's their mandate. It's a fantastic award. It's funny. You could find all sorts of weird findings in there, but that actually make a scientific contribution. And so that's what he did, because his work made a huge contribution to the literature on misinformation. But yeah, the studies and research that he did is they basically found what's called bullshit generators on the internet. So you could make a whole bunch of, again, seemingly profound words make sense. So meaning, we're in the midst of a quantum blossoming soup, and I will treat you with my intracellular connections, and we will find a way to remedy your frequencies. So what I just said is completely meaningless. It sounds profound, but it's meaningless. And they entered the stuff in the bullshit generator, and the research found that participants weren't good at differentiating that bullshit generator from Deepak Chopra's Twitter feed.
So that's specific. It gets that specific. And with your history in psychology, that to me sounded like a word salad, but I knew that you were doing it. And I guess if we don't know that you're doing it, then we can buy into it. Brandolini's Law, there's a lot of bullshit out there. Please do your best to dispel that. And if you need help doing that, any physician out there, or really anyone, mind the science. I love the book. Amazing and such important work to help us understand what the wellness industry is doing to the psychiatry movement and to the healthcare movement at large. So thank you for fighting the good fight. And thank you for finally making time and all you do for your patients.
That means so much to me, Brad. So thanks so much for your endorsement. And this is a lot of fun. So thanks for having me finally. And again, thanks for your patience.
Thanks for listening. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.